Welcome. My name is Jonathan Sarna, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our Schusterman seminar, the first seminar of the second semester here at Brandeis University. And we're extraordinarily fortunate that our semester is going to begin and our series be kicked off with Professor Pnina Lahav. Pnina Lahav is really one of the pioneers of Israel studies, a longtime friend of our Schusterman Center. She's Emerita Professor of Law and a member of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies at Boston University. She, of course, is a great expert in law and has put her expertise most famously in a book that everyone in Israel studies reads, Justice in Jerusalem, Chief Justice Simon Agranat and the Zionist Century. She won the Israel Studies Award for Lifetime Achievement. And recently, she has turned her attention to the status and history of women, and specifically to a forthcoming biography of Golda Meir, Israel's fourth prime minister, which she is examining through a gender lens. We are essentially getting a preview of this very important book, which we are all awaiting. And the book is entitled The Only Woman in the Room, Golda Meir and Her Path to Power, which Princeton will publish later this year. You may well have questions and comments, and I encourage you to put them in the chat. And the moderator of the chat feature today will be handling questions after Professor Lahav is finished, is Maya Dworsky Arocha. She is a Schusterman Fellow. She is adjunct lecturer in anthropology at Babson College. She, of course, is from Israel, and she studies childhood, whiteness, militarism in education. She has an MA from Brandeis and is now a doctoral candidate in our anthropology department. So we welcome Maya, whom you will meet following Professor Lahav's lecture. Without further ado, Pnina Lahav, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for the team at Schusterman, the Schusterman Center, for this invitation. I'm a great admirer of the programs at the Schusterman Center, and I often zoom in to attend your events. And therefore, I'm particularly happy to be here to speak, and even happier to have the opportunity to speak about Golda. So heartfelt thanks to Jonathan Sarna, Anna Simpson, and their team in organizing this event. Thank you. Let me begin by reflecting on why I decided to write this biography. There are numerous biographies of Golda Meir in the market. The best is Meron Medzini's book, Golda Meir, A Political Biography. And following in its footsteps is Francine Klaxbrun's book titled Lioness. I came to this project by way of seeking closure. I started my career with a provocative article titled The Status of Women in Israel, Myth and Reality, which was published in the American Journal of Comparative Law in 1974. What I tried to do there was try to debunk the myth that Israeli law and culture supports women's equality, is in favor of gender equality. That was 1974. when I was still a graduate student at Yale Law School. Almost 50 years later, 50, I was contemplating my retirement and looked for an appropriate project that would end my career with a bit of a bang. I knew, in the area of women, that is, women's history, I know that I wanted to return to the subject of the status of women in Israel. I thought that addressing the issue of women in Israel, their struggle for gender equality, their achievements, as well as their disappointments, would be the right path. This time, I wish to focus on the great women who, despite unfavorable conditions, persevered and reached positions of leadership. Golda represented the success and the failures of this remarkable history. So this book is not only about the history of Israeli women, but it is also a call on young women everywhere to reappraise Golda, appreciate her life work, and embrace her as an asset, but also as a sister in the never-ending fight for equality and self-fulfillment. Let me begin with Golda's overall trajectory. She was born to a very traditional Jewish family in Russia, and her family immigrated to the United States in 1906, more than 100 years ago. Her parents expected her to grow into a traditional woman, a true balabuste, Yiddish term for homemaker. Her mother trained her to keep the house clean, to mend and iron the family clothing, to cook the traditional dishes from gefilte fish to knishes and make chicken soup, and most importantly, marry a well-to-do man who would support her and their family. In other words, her parents were thinking inside the box. They did not expect anything that was not ordinary or conventional. And then, when you look at the slides that I collected, and we will start with slide 2 and 3, please. So here is Golda as a young girl, maybe 4, 5, 6 years old. What you see is a transformation. This is Golda 2, 3 years old. Then we have Golda, slide 4, as a teenager. Yes, with her hair loose, her in profile, admiring herself. And then when you go forward to slide 4, you see Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, in the White House, coming to a festive White House dinner in her honor. You see the President of the United States, you see First Lady Pat Nixon, and in the middle, Golda, quite an old woman, 70 years old and more, but quite distinguished and graceful, in my opinion. So Golda, when you see this, you see the trajectory of her career from this little girl who was groomed to be a balabuste and married well, and that's all, look good, cook, clean, and that's all, to somebody who basically comes to the White House and deals with international affairs, talks about war and peace. And so what is interesting here, what the slides here tell, is the story of female agency. Consider the trajectory. From a little girl groomed to be a balabuste in Tsarist Russia, she becomes the chief decision maker of her country, and she is accepted as such by the world. That's the amazing thing, and that's what I hope every man and woman take to heart. We have in our history women who rose to these heights, and we should study them and be proud of their achievement. The question that I wanted to address is, how did she do it? What obstacles did she encounter on the way? And how did she overcome these obstacles? That's what my book is about. Another angle of Golda's feminist profile, which I cover in my book, is Golda's more specific contributions to the welfare of Israeli women that some people tend to forget now, particularly Israelis tend to forget it, and this is something that I would like to revive. Golda believed deeply in socialism and was a leader of Mapai, Israel's Labor Party. In 1949, which was the major party in Israel, in Israeli politics until the 70s. In 1949, 1 year after Israel's independence, Golda prevailed over Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to give her the labor portfolio in the first Israeli cabinet. In this capacity, she brought the American New Deal to Israel. Her legislation included statutes that guaranteed minimum hours of work, not more than 8 hours per person per day, minimum wages, mandatory annual vacation, something that you don't have in the United States, sick leave, something that you don't have in the United States, and more. That was in the early 50s. The jewel in the crown of this legislation was Israel's Social Security law, which guaranteed a decent quality of life to all Israelis and was enacted against the fierce opposition of the Minister of Finance, who thought that Israel could not afford it. But she insisted and she prevailed. A piece of this agenda targeted women's rights. In the United States, we still do not have mandatory maternity leave. We depend on the goodwill of the employer. If he wants to give you a maternity leave, he will, or she, but they are not obliged to do so. Golda led the Knesset to enact mandatory maternity leave as early as 1954. And then the law changed also into paternity leave, but this is not the issue of this lecture. The Knesset enacted mandatory maternity leave as early as 1954. Working women were protected under law. They could not be fired by the employer because they were pregnant. And when they gave birth, the employer was obliged to let them stay at home for 3 months in order to care for the newborn. And I should also add that, that birth in Israel under the Social Security law was covered by the state. The state paid for it. And also the state paid for the mandatory maternity leave. It was not left for the employer. Under Golda's leadership, the state of Israel took upon itself to pay for this mandatory maternity leave because Golda suspected that the employers will not do it happily. A controversial issue that came up in this context was the possibility of allowing the pregnant woman to take time off prior to birth, a few days or a few weeks before her due date. In the legislative committee in the Knesset, the argument was raised that a woman might abuse this privilege, and therefore it was suggested that she, the woman, would be required to bring a medical certificate that confirms that she indeed qualified for the privilege. You will recognize this idea as paternalistic, a distrust in the woman's ability to take such a decision, a distrust in her agency. During the parliamentary debate, Golda Meir, the Minister of Labor, rejected this paternalistic attitude, and I quote, "Let her make this decision by herself." End of quote. And to the opposition, she said, and I quote, "Members of the Knesset, you must understand that the woman is not a nebechil." Quote, end of quote. Now, nebechil is a Yiddish term. The male term for nebechil is nebech or nebesh. Somebody who is totally inept, cannot do anything, okay? And what Golda says is, the woman, I love this sentence, the woman is not a nebechil. And she says, I quote, she said in Parliament, I quote, "She knows quite well what is good for her and can act accordingly." So remember this sentence, I urge you. The woman is not a nebechil. Similarly, throughout this debate, and in other contexts as well, Golda stated that women are 50% of the population, and therefore entitled to have their voice heard and respected. In other words, and take this to heart, women are not a minority, as some of us sometimes tend to think. Women are a majority, members of the majority, and they are entitled to have their view heard and implemented. But Golda was a savvy politician and practical, and she knew the treacherous and sand dunes around her. She was careful not to declare herself a feminist. She knew that the term feminism and feminist might invite a backlash. She needed the support of men to lead the social reform that she was planning and succeed in politics. She needed men. And therefore, she surrounded herself with men, not with women. And here we can see a few slides. We can go, for example, to slide 7. You see Golda, this is her first cabinet in 1971. Golda stands there in white. And by the way, white is also interesting because white was the color of the suffragists in the United States that Golda experienced in Milwaukee at the turn of the century before the constitutional right to vote was enacted. So here is Golda, and everybody around her are men, a cabinet full of men. Then if we go to slide 9, we see Golda sitting at a cabinet meeting or a gathering or whatever it is. Everybody is male except for Golda. And on the side, if you look at the right, some of you may recognize Moshe Dayan with a patch, okay? A real womanizer and admired greatly by Israelis as an expert on defense. And if you go to slide 13, please. Again, this is the first meeting of the first Israeli cabinet in Israel, the first Israeli cabinet. And you see David Ben-Gurion sitting there at the head of the table. And everybody around the table is a man, except for Golda to the left, who was Minister of Labor. And you also see her bag, which was also a signature of her appearance, okay? So all of these guys, she was surrounded by guys all the time. Ben-Gurion chose the guys. They were in the very first cabinet, and she continued this trend. And she appointed only men to her cabinets. Okay. Cabinet ministers, directors general of governmental offices, persons in the security apparatus, judges and justices of the Supreme Court, all were men, and not necessarily feminist men. They did not really think too highly of women for positions of power. And this is my major grievance against Golda, and what in my mind is the biggest mistake of her career. She accepted the conventional expectation that men are better at leadership. She did not trust her own example. As a result, we, the women of my generation, and those who came thereafter, my students, my daughters, my granddaughter, people in the audience, did not have enough role models to look up to. And that's what I'm trying to correct in this book. Golda thereby became an exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. By and large, Golda was admired by the American people and by Israelis. They trusted her, admired her backbone and toughness, and enjoyed her quick wit. For her part, she encouraged them to feel self-righteous and morally superior, such as when she said, and I quote, "We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but we can never forgive them for forcing us to kill their children." Such statement, while amusing, failed to nurture empathy and an understanding of the other. Which brings me, and I would like to think, and I also believe, that if Golda paused to think rather than to quickly throw out this sentence and get accolades for it, if she rethought it, she wouldn't have said it. But she did. Which brings me to the final part of my talk. I wish to talk about Golda and war. In the modern age, and until very recently, a woman who sought a political career was generally channeled towards roles associated with a traditional gender role. A woman was typically expected to fill the position of a minister of education, of health, and so on. Roles that fit the woman in the minds of the decision makers. Golda did not accept this division of labor. As prime minister, she was the civilian head of the Israeli military machine. And we can see, that would be slides 5, please. We can see Golda visiting the troops during the Yom Kippur War. She went down to the Sinai, flew down to the Sinai to visit the troops. And you see surrounding her, of course, all the officers and the generals. Golda was the civilian head of the military machine, what we call in the United States. When you look in the American law, the equivalent is the president as commander-in-chief. She was the commander-in-chief, even though Israeli law is a little bit more complex, but that is the situation. She was also the head of the Mossad and of Shin Bet, the internal security services. In American terms, she was the head of the CIA and of the FBI. Think about the fact that in the United States, the first woman to be appointed as head of the CIA, Gina Haspel, was confirmed in 2018, 47 years, almost half a century after Golda assumed the position in Israel. Golda understood well the security needs of Israel, was familiar with the machinations of the security apparatus, and did not hesitate to make tough decisions. And yet, in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War erupted and inflicted perhaps the deepest trauma on Israel and on Israelis, the people looked for a scapegoat. And Golda's womanhood was an easy target. The old stereotype of the woman, irrational, emotional, cunning, motivated by hatred, whim and caprice, was revived, and people were encouraged to believe that this was at the root of the Yom Kippur trauma. If they didn't have a woman, it wouldn't have happened. I try to document this phenomenon in my book. I'm not trying to claim that Golda did not have her share of blame for the Yom Kippur War, but I do want to point out that some of the blame is animated by traditional gender-based stereotypes and therefore deserve our critical examination. This is why I call this book a feminist biography. I try to show how gender-based stereotypes were used and abused for the purpose of targeting Golda's womanhood. In the process, Golda's sterling achievement in the areas of labor law have been ignored, and other matters as well, are still ignored. And Israelis are encouraged to think that women are unfit for top leadership positions. Today, we begin to see a change in the public perception of Golda's role in that horrid war. A part of the change should be attributed to the willingness of several archives to open their collections so that we know more about what Golda tried to do and what she was planning to achieve, what were her plans. Another part of the change that occurred relatively recently must be attributed to the zeitgeist. Gender equality is more acceptable today than it used to be 30 or 20 years ago. And it is easier to identify sexist stereotypes and male chauvinist explanations. Thus, people, especially in Israel today, are more willing to give credit to Golda for the courageous competent way she managed the Yom Kippur War, at a time when many of the military officers were shaken to their core, losing their faith in Israel's ability to win. She was there to hold their hand and lead them to actually triumph. But the Yom Kippur War, although traumatic and very important historically, is a very minor part of my Golda project. What I really wanted to capture is Golda's agency and perseverance in the face of sexism and male chauvinism. I wish to show how, from a very early age, she insisted on her right to self-fulfillment and agency. How she worked hard and against all odds to climb up the political ladder, because she was not encouraged to do it in the beginning. The political ladder that was biased and uninviting, and how she has been and should remain a role model to girls and to women who want more than domestic bliss in their lives. Golda teaches us that being a woman in politics is, as she said, hard, 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 but that it is doable. Before Martin Luther King, she already insisted that if this is what a woman wants, she should keep her eyes on the prize and persevere, and we should help her. The prize, as she saw it, was self-fulfillment and engagement with the work she loved, politics. And that's what she did. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lahav. So we have a few questions here from the chat. First of all, thank you so much for that incredible talk. It was fascinating. We have a lot of questions that people are asking. So the first one, I think is unsurprising, is a question from Wendy Bornstein about Golda Meir's inspiration to other women of her generation, especially Jewish women, specifically Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And do we see any specific inspirations from Golda in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life?
I don't know about inspiration. I should say that the first article that I wrote that I was talking about from 1974, that article was published with the help of Justice Ginsburg. I was a student at Yale. She was a professor at Columbia, and she helped me and edited my piece, and it was published in the American Journal of Comparative Law. So I owe her a great debt. And but she was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think what we should remember two things about her. First of all, she this was a different period, okay? So there was more acceptance of feminism in the air than was during the time when Golda was doing politics. And so that's very, very important. But I do know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg looked for role models, and she certainly looked up to role models in order to, encourage herself to go forward and do what she did. She was the first justice of the Supreme Court. That was not an easy matter. I also want to say, in contradistinction to Golda, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a partner, that is Martin Ginsburg, her husband, was very supportive and very helpful, okay? And so I think her marriage also encouraged her to do what she wanted. Golda was alone, okay? She separated from her husband in the late 20s. She didn't have anybody really support her in her ambitions, and she did it all by herself. So, you can think about it, how much you want to, what do we make of it? It's a great question, but she did it all by herself,
Thank you, that's great. Great. We have another slightly more pointed question from Mir Diamond. Did Golda serve in the IDF? Did she ever, was she ever a soldier in the Israeli army?
Yeah, so Golda was 50 years old when Israel became a state. So the military, the IDF did not take women of that age. But the IDF did not exist when Golda was rising to power, and she was not a soldier in the IDF. I want to say two things about it because it's a very good question actually, because Israelis generally attach great significance to the question of whether you served or you didn't serve. Golda did try, as a young teenager, to join the fight in the United States during the First World War. She did try that, but they rejected her because she was a woman. So she could not join any organization that was fighting or giving training to women to fight the war. Women were not welcome during the First World War in any capacity. Then when she went to Israel or to Palestine and she was in a kibbutz, the same thing happened. The Israelis, as I said before, were relatively sexist. So for them, a woman holding a gun was not acceptable. Okay, and don't believe the various photos that you see with a woman holding a gun. These are all for publicity. Okay, so they did not put a woman in the guarding places, points in the kibbutz or anywhere else. The women were excluded from these positions and these tasks. And so therefore Golda did not have a chance. And I want to compare it because the person who asked the question puts his finger on a very good point. David Ben-Gurion was drafted into the Turkish army. And therefore you have his photo in all of his biographies, in uniform, in military uniform. And the idea that you get into your mind is the man was fighting, okay? Here you have a fighter. Because Golda was excluded from all the organizations that were, that did combat duty, she doesn't have such a picture. It's very simple, you know? And it tells you again something about the history of women. And I can go on and elaborate it, but it's a very good point.
No, thank you. It's the gender has a very specific place within a militaristic society.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. So yes. To go off of that, our own Mika Hackner has a two-part question.
Okay.
About how Israeli society managed to marry this duality that she represented of this hawkish representative of war and a domestic socialist, someone who was able to both, take care of the Israeli society and defend it. And then the second part of that is, was it sort of worked into a dichotomy of gender, much like Margaret Thatcher, where there was this constant ambivalence surrounding her gender?
Yeah, I don't know that Golda was ambivalent about her gender in the way that Margaret Thatcher was, and I don't want to get into it right now. I'm not so sure that this is correct. But I think the other question is important, which is how do you reconcile Golda's socialism and commitment to the public good with the militaristic goals, if you wish, of Israel? I just want to say first of all, in my opinion, she did not see it. Okay, she thought that the IDF is also working towards the public good. And it took a long time for Israelis to begin to understand the role of militarism in Israeli society, and they are not there yet. but you know, they are getting better. So it's a question of consciousness as of many other things. She just did not she came from a different perspective and a different time. We always also have to understand the time that she was operating in.
Absolutely, thank you. That actually leads us to Eva Gorovich's question about, do we know what Golda's reaction was to second wave feminism in the 1970s?
Yes, we do know, and actually I even have it's a great question. Again, where people ask wonderful questions. I have a slide here for you. I was hoping that somebody will ask the question. So slide number 14, please. So the second wave feminism rose in the 70s when Golda was at the height of her power as prime minister. And I hope that Riza will find the slide 14 because people will enjoy seeing it. And Golda had a very complex relationship with them, with a feminist movement, a very complex relationship. If we see first of all, the women, the leaders of the second wave feminism here. So if you see this photo, if we can enlarge it, I don't know if we can. This was a poster that was put up by the leaders of the feminists of the second wave feminism in the United States. In California, it was in the early 70s, and it was a poster, and the question was, but can she type? Okay, and the message was, here we have a prime minister who also the commander-in-chief of the military. And but we still expect her as a woman to type. And the answer is no, she cannot type, okay? But she can lead the military, and she can lead the CIA, and she can do other things, and she can enact labor laws, whatever, okay? So, so in the United States, there was a lot of enthusiasm to Golda in the beginning. But then what happened, this is a part of American history, that the left, that the second wave feminism was identified mostly with the left, and the left began to identify more and more with the Palestinian cause. And the more they identified with the Palestinian cause and the more critical they became of Israel in the early 70s, the more negative Golda became towards the movement. So at the end, she distanced herself from the feminist movement. And this is one of my sorrows. I think it was a mistake. And I think that both sides are to blame for it. And I elaborate on this in my book.
That is fascinating. I think that a lot of the questions we're getting are sort of honing in on that specific friction. Because there's, especially when it comes to the changes in feminism, the adoption of the idea of intersectional feminism, what would Golda's place be if she had one in that sort of type of thought that we are this inability to break between the political and the private? It seems like so much of Golda's private life was political. What do you imagine her place would be in the current discourse of not only feminism, but feminism as it exists within national and identity contexts?
Yeah, okay, so again, a very good question. Golda, in her private life, Golda was basically fulfilling the agenda of the feminist movement. She decided that she wanted to have children, even though some people told her that she shouldn't because she's so ambitious. But she said she's not giving up on this privilege, okay? She raised her children with babysitters, okay? She continued going to work, and it is said about her that she neglected her children. This is probably true, okay? And she also tried to make tikkun and to pay for it in different ways, okay? This is one thing that we should understand about Golda. She did not give up on the things that she wanted to do and to have. She wanted children, she wanted a family, she did it, okay? There were compromises to be made and she made them. And the children came out very well. You know, her daughter participated in the establishment of a kibbutz, okay, and was quite an accomplished woman. And her son was a very accomplished cellist, okay, playing the cello, a musician of the first rate. And so, you know, it's not as if they didn't suffer, but she tried to make up for it, that's all. What she did not do is sacrifice her ambition and interests and urge to fulfill herself for the sake of others. That she did not do, that is correct. So you draw your own conclusions, whether you want to learn from her or not. She was against sacrificing the core or the essence of her personality. That is very true. She did say it explicitly.
It comes back to the
people should be interested in, and I will just mention it in passing. In the United States, we have a very big argument and conflict about abortion. I would like to tell our audience that Golda did have an abortion in her youth. After she got married, she was probably 20 or 21. She had an abortion, and which tells you, which was illegal in the United States at the time, and which tells you that Golda understood what's good for her. And because she was 20 and just married and had plans to go to Palestine and join a kibbutz, etc., she didn't feel that she was ready. And eventually, after a few years, she did have children. So, you know, I see it as a plus, not as a minus.
No, I think it's a wonderful demonstration of what you were talking about, the female agency.
Agency, exactly.
She gets to make her own decisions.
Exactly. And that she said from the beginning. She wants to make her own decisions. I also want to tell your audience, which I did not mention before, is Golda wanted education. And those of us who are familiar with Jewish education in the 19th century, when she was born, and where her parents were shaped, the education of a woman was not considered to be an important thing. And parents did not would do everything to send the boy to Cheder to study, but would do nothing to send the girl to Cheder, okay, or to acquire an education. And so when Golda was 14 years old, she wanted to go to high school because she wanted to become a teacher. And her mother said to her, no, you're not going to do it. And her father said to her, men do not like smart girls. Okay? And so what she did is she ran away to Denver, Colorado, where her sister lived. And there she enrolled in high school and graduated high school. So she did not give up on the things that she thought were essential for her, for the development of herself, be it family, be it children, be it education.
Excellent, thank you. So continuing with this idea of women choosing, women perhaps empowering each other, even if it's further down the line than in the same generation they were born into. We had a few questions about her relationship to the Mizrahi community in Israel, maybe specifically Mizrahi women.
Yeah, okay, so this is also a very, very important question. And there is this incident, okay, that is very famous in Golda's history and in Israeli history, of the revolt of or uprising of the Black Panthers in Israel in the early 70s, where they were protesting very, very, very difficult social conditions that they lived under in the slums of Jerusalem and other cities as well. And when the matter came to Golda, she is famous for having said the following sentence: "They are not nice. They are not lovely." Okay, and this was a response to one of the leaders of the Moroccan community in Jerusalem, who came to her and said, "You know, I met them. These guys who are doing the protest. I met them, and they are quite nice." And her response was, "No, they are not nice." Now, put it in context, okay? Put it in context. Just to say they are not nice, that's quite damning. But if you look at what happened at that moment, the news came to her as she was sitting in a press conference that the Black Panthers one of the Black Panthers threw a Molotov cocktail. Okay, everybody knows what is a Molotov cocktail. It's a little bomb into the crowd during the protest, okay? She reacted to that. She said, people who throw Molotov cocktails are not nice, period. So it was not a comment on the Mizrahi Jews. It was a comment on people who take the law into their hands and use violence, first of all, okay? Second thing I want to say is that her daughter, Sarah, who established the kibbutz, was married to a Yemenite man, okay? A young Yemenite man, and he was quite dark, okay? In the United States, in my opinion, he would pass for a black, okay? Or for a Latino, okay? And and his name, furthermore, was not the traditional or expected Israeli name, but it was Zechariah, which in the United States, Zachary is quite popular, but in Israel, it's not popular. And it designates you as a member of the Mizrahi community, okay? And Golda, I think this is to her credit, accepted him, okay? Embraced him, and even took him with her to Moscow when she became, with her daughter, of course, when she became the emissary, the Israeli emissary to the Soviet Union. So she accepted, and also there were other men in her family who married members of her family, other men who married members of her family. So I would think that she must have been slightly ambivalent in the beginning, okay? And the reason for that is that the Israeli position and the position of the Labor Party at the time and the leadership was that the Mizrahi Jews should come to Israel and be absorbed in Israel, but they are not as good as the Ashkenazim. They are not as educated, they are not as bright, you know, we are going to take them, but you know, they are not what we expected, okay? That was the understanding in the early 50s. So what you see from Golda, when you see her there are various statements that she made about the need to encourage and educate the Mizrahi Jews. And these statements come from, reflect, I would say, the Israeli majority. That's what Israelis thought at the time, okay? It's sad that they did, and we should be very critical of it, very critical. I'm not trying to justify it in any way, but I'm saying she reflected the value system of the time. And so to target her as being racist, I think is a little bit too much, okay? I would think that if she was such a racist, she would not allow her daughter to marry a Yemenite Jew, which was at the bottom of the hierarchy in the social hierarchy of Israel. I don't think she would have accepted it. Okay, but she was brave. She raised her hand. She put her chin up. She let her daughter do what her daughter wanted, because the daughter also wanted to fulfill herself. Yes. And from what I know is she was very, very supportive of her grandchildren. So those grandchildren who came up actually slightly looking like Yemenite Jews, okay? She did not discriminate against them, okay? She embraced them like she embraced everybody else. And I can tell you, I know a lot of Ashkenazi women who did not do that, okay? It was a hard thing for the white Ashkenazi Israeli woman to accept a daughter marrying, a Mizrahi Jew. It was hard. And she did it, and she displayed it in public to show that she's not ashamed of it. I think it's, say something about her.
I think it's sort of a continuation of Golda saying something and then doing something radical.
Yes,
she says,
exactly. I think that's true. That's a very good point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She was quite conventional in her sayings, but in her actions, she was, she was quite radical and daring. Yeah.
Great. So we have two more questions that are slightly different, but I actually think they are somewhat connected.
Okay.
So Golda is going through a golden age right now.
Exactly.
We are going through a golden age.
Beginning. It's only the beginning. Only the beginning. Yeah. And it was not so when I started my book, by the way.
Yes, you've started this. They're getting ready for you. It's perfect.
Yes, thank you.
So there are films coming out in which she is being played by very, very famous actresses. Yes. She has been played by very famous actresses. Ingrid Bergman.
Yes.
So what do you think this means about not only the way women are being thought of, powerful women are being thought of, but specifically powerful Jewish women and powerful Israeli women are being considered in the global
well, I think it's a great point. I think what it reflects the thirst that we have as women, and also as feminist men. I mean, there is a lot of feminists now in the male space as well. Okay, men begin to understand feminism differently and embracing it as an ideology. And I think all of those people are thirsty for role models, for stories, for an understanding of exactly what it was like and what these great women were trying to achieve. So what was their vulnerability, what they fought against, how they adjusted themselves to the situation of the time. So all of these things, I think, lead a person like Barbara Streisand is one of the women who is now engaged in a television series on Golda. And another one is Helen Mirren. And great actresses both. And I think they are looking, okay, because there is a need in the public to see how was it done way back when a society was quite sexist. So how did they do it? And how did they feel? That's the point.
Thank you so much. So we actually had a new question. How do you compare Golda with Ayelet Shaked? And I would sort of blow that up a little bit into women Israeli politicians in general and women leaders in Israel. How much of their DNA do you think can be traced back to Golda?
Well, I would say it should. You know, Ayelet Shaked is a very impressive woman. I don't agree with any of her policies, but I cannot deny that she's very bright and very able. I wish she were on my side of things, but Ayelet Shaked has the backbone and the willpower that Golda had. And I did not talk to Ayelet Shaked about this, but I will not be surprised if she looked at Golda and emulated some of Golda's mode of action. I would not be surprised that Golda was a role model for her. I would also say that, you know, I did meet, and I also have it in my book, a few women who saw Golda as a role model. One of them is, for example, a justice of the Supreme Court, Daphna Barak Erez, a young justice of the Supreme Court, brilliant. And she also told me that Golda was her hero when she was young. And another one, Ronit Rubinfeld, who is a brilliant mathematician at MIT, okay, an Israeli woman. She also was looking for books about Golda when she was young. And what it tells us is, we women need the role models. We want to hear how they did it, what they went through, okay, and to get some strength from that.
Excellent, thank you. I don't think there's any Israeli woman who didn't go through at some point thinking of herself in the shadow of Golda Meir, I hope.
Yes.
So we have a question from our own Risa. Can you talk about your research process for the book?
For the book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was a very long process because I was a professor of law and I was teaching constitutional law at Boston University. So a lot of my time was devoted to other things that I was doing. I visited a lot of archives, particularly the Israeli archives, but there is a very good archive in Milwaukee, in the Golda Meir Library in Milwaukee. They have a very nice archive, so I visited there. I read a lot of letters that Golda wrote, okay, to her husband, to other people. I read a lot of newspapers from the 20 onwards, because one of the things that I was trying to say, I mentioned it already, and I will mention it again maybe, is I wanted to understand Golda's history in full. So one of my first questions was, how did Golda feel about the right to vote in the United States? Okay, the fight of the suffragists. And to me, the fact that she was dressed in white, there is a very early photo of Golda, I don't have it here, in the kibbutz, dressed in white. Now, to be dressed in white in a kibbutz in the early 20s was quite daring, because, there were no washing machines. You could get dirty very easily. You would have to iron the thing, okay? It's as you know, every woman knows that to dress in white is quite risky, okay? And here you have, she ordered the white clothes, and she made for herself, she could sew, of course. That's what one of the things her mother taught us to do, is to sew. And she sewed for herself this outfit in white. And my question is, why white? So one answer is, she looked very well in white. Well, that's nice. But black actually is much more comfortable and practical, right? I think that has to do with the suffragist movement. That she identified with their struggle. I mean, we know that Hillary Clinton would wear white also to certain political events. So this was way back before. And I think even though she didn't say anything, in her mind, she was connected to those brave women who insisted on the right to be a part of politics. That's the thing, okay? She said in a very famous interview with the journalist Oriana Fallaci, the famous Italian journalist, she said, domestic bliss was not for me, okay? So she said it explicitly. She wanted to work in politics and to make a difference. That's what she wanted. But at the same time, she did not want to give up the idea of having a family. She did not want to give up the idea of having children. And I'm not going to talk about it here, but she did not want to give up the idea of having sex. Okay? So her sexuality was important to her. And she had lovers. After she separated from her husband, she had lovers. And I personally think there's nothing bad about that. And she, everybody will excuse me who disagree with his, values. She had lovers, she had sex, she had an abortion, she had children, she had it all. And it did not prevent her from analyzing politics very shrewdly and carefully. That's the point that I want to make. She did not, she did not adhere to the stereotype of the feminine.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be selfish for a minute, and I'm going to ask a question that I want to ask. because we keep coming back to it, is the fact that she spent a pretty important part of her life in the United States, struggling with the laws of the United States. I know she and her family had some altercations with the education system.
Yes.
And we are currently also having a series of leaders with personal connections to the United States.
Yes.
And I think that is a different legacy
yes.
that she has left. So if you would speak on that.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, there is a love, I don't want to say hate. There is a loving connection between Israel and the United States, okay? We look at you, I'm speaking as an Israeli, right? We look at you, we look at your achievements, we want to emulate some, the entire, from my perspective and my career, the entire civil rights movement, the legacy of all men are created equal, hopefully women too, the women's movement, all of these are things that Israelis look at and want to emulate, okay, and want to learn from. And on the other hand, the Israeli old socialism, okay, that was a very important part of Zionism, okay, in the first half of the century. Americans liked it. Americans were very attached to it, okay? So this idea of all men are created equal and women, you know, was translated in the kibbutz to at least the myth that everybody is equal, okay? And the Americans were impressed by that and were drawn to it. So there is, we have a symbiotic relationship, particularly American Jews and Israelis. But I think Americans in general have an interest in Israel because of what Israel tries to achieve. They are also critical. I'm not against that either. But Israel also has many achievements, significant achievements, and Israelis are proud of it, and I think American Jews are proud of it as well. And ordinary Americans are also, impressed by what we have managed to do.
The relationship has always been a source of fascination and
exactly.
Strength.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been so lovely. Thank you, everyone who came. Thank you so much to Professor Lahav. Please join us in our next seminar, which will be on February 3rd. We'll be hearing from Ori Yehudai, A Day of Blood and Valor, Terrorism and Social Tension in 1970s Israel.
Very interesting.
Thank you
that's
so
exactly
much.
Just for your public who were listening to this. That's when Golda was, emerging actually as a hawk and a right-winger, exactly because of the terrorism that she was experiencing as prime minister. So that's actually, it's a very, very valid and relevant lecture to our understanding, and I'm sure I will listen to it. I look forward to it. And I want to thank you for conducting this Q&A session. And I want to thank Anna Simpson again, and to thank Jonathan Sarna for inviting me. I had a great time.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Maya.